I'm Dave Muhovich in the nursing department here at Bethel University. I've been part of the faculty for about 14 years. I teach a number of different courses in our regular College of Arts and Sciences, in our degree completion, and some in our graduate program as well. And my favorite is cultural diversity in healthcare.
Kind of a similar story. My name is Karen Drake. I also teach in the nursing department. I teach a variety of courses in both the graduate program, the degree completion, and also the day program. I think the first one is the place that's chosen. The place should be one where students can experience immersion. They should be able to interact with individuals from the culture. We really like to have them interact with nursing students when we take them, nursing students who are at their same age, their age mates. So they're experiencing some of life. Not only are they all studying nursing, but they're thinking about marriage and they're thinking of other things that make for really good cultural exchanges. Besides place, I think students need really good preparation. So this involves meeting with them. In our case, the trip is a January trip, so meeting with them in November and December and preparing them for what they will see and experience. There also needs to be a plan for processing with them. We use reflection journaling. We process with them many times daily. I think one of the most important ones, and this is something that faculty members have very little control over, and that is what we call, after one of our nursing theorists, cultural desire. It's kind of the idea that you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. The idea that you can put them in places where they are exposed to all sorts of wonderful things, but in the end, the best students who really get the most out of it are those who really are open and are really wanting to learn.
For me as an individual, it's quite out of my gifting. Getting us there is out of my gifting. But initially, it was just because I personally valued the experience of refreshing my relationships there, but watching the rate at which students learn, it's a very wonderful as a teacher, as a facilitator of learning, to see how much learning can happen in a period of time. Not with every student all the time, but so it energizes me to see the place in the people and to be involved in the learning experience. It enhances the professionalism in nursing that facilitates collaboration, working together in a group, but there's also a lot of autonomy and self-direction that myself and each student needs to be involved with. I think the last aspect I'd like to highlight is the repeated aha experience that, especially since we go to Africa, they have a sense of, usually inaccurate sense of what Africa is going to be like. And especially they think that they're going to be the ones who teach and share, and they know they're from the sophisticated culture. And they go and they fall in love just like with the culture, just like we did, and they learn more than they teach, and they receive more than they give, and it blows them away to see the maturity of Christian faith in the village and urban African believers. trusting Jesus is a wonderful thing that bends our students' minds. It's not what they expect, even though they might intellectually know that. To see it and to feel it it's really rewarding for me. And in fact, I also enjoy the giants of faith that we get to hang out with.
The transformation that you see in students when you work with them, even though from a faculty perspective it is an intense investment of time. You're pretty much with them 24 hours a day. I've been on trips where housing demanded that I share a room with two of the students. And you get to, the other thing I think is really getting to know students at a level that we don't always have time when we're on campus. You're hours on buses and experiencing things. It's for many of them a time to rethink about who they are, what their life's plans are, how interacting with another culture. Some of our nursing students are seeking whether God is calling them to some kind of service in a setting like that, and others are just looking to learn more. And so it is a really wonderful time, a way, and it's, I think, where I've gotten some of the closest relationships with students is spending 27 days with them in sometimes less than ideal circumstances, and we get to know each other really well. They get to know us as faculty members in very, very different ways because they live with us too 24 hours a day. And so that, I think, is very, very rewarding. It's also because we have, unlike other trip leaders, we do have the chance to see the students when they come back, and applying some of that knowledge. The year I did my study and actually interviewed all of them to realize how they are then applying it to nursing care. They've learned things about caring for patients from diverse backgrounds, and they're able to make that application. So those are the things that really make it worthwhile. When we think about facilitating students' cultural learning, I think one of the important things is for those of us who are leading to have some idea of what our goal is. And out of my study came the ideas of thinking about emic and etic. Emic and etic come out of the world of linguistics, phonemic, and emic is the idea that there is an insider view, a person who lives within the culture, breathes it, knows it well as an insider. And then there is the etic view, which is the outsider view looking in. So when we think about what our students will experience, we first of all, as literature tells us, students need to understand who they are. And we find very interestingly that some of our students kind of think as Western young people, that they don't have culture. Culture is what other people have. So one of the first experiences we ask of our students, we use a Purnell cultural learning model that what its advantage is it just describes kind of every area of life and society, from your family, from your education, from the geography and all those things. So we ask them before the trip to kind of look at themselves using that list of 12 domains. So that enhances, before they leave on a trip, they have had to think seriously about this emic perspective about themselves. We help them, before we leave, to get a little bit of an idea in terms of what is the outsider view by giving them information about the country where we are taking them, in this case, Uganda. So we tell them as much as we know. Again, we, especially Dave, frequently uses the outline, the same outline we've asked them to, in terms of describing the culture. Then when they arrive there, what you will find is that students are suddenly face-to-face. Now it's not textbook or discussion, they're face-to-face with this other culture they have been thinking about and hearing us talk about. And that does two things. Of course, it does improve their etic view. They're in the country, they're face to face with the culture, so they get a much clearer glimpse of what this culture is like. However, there are a lot of things about themselves that they have not thought about, and so their own emic view is being enhanced greatly. What we hope by immersion experiences, and granted in a 1-month interim trip, they are limited, but we hope that the kind of experiences we plan for students will allow them to have what I call emic glimpses into the other culture. They come alongside somebody or a few somebodies enough that they have some idea of what the world looks like from the other person's perspective. That's what I call the emic glimpses. And then when that experience is over and they are back in the U.S., the final kind of experience that our students have is that they suddenly step back and look at their own culture from the etic perspective. I have had them write in journals, I was shopping in Cub grocery store and I thought of my friend so-and-so next to me and I was embarrassed at the plenty and the things we have. And you see them suddenly looking at their culture from the outside in. So first of all, I think it's important for those of us who lead trips to understand that this is the kind of experience that we will expect from our students. So the question then comes, how do you help students maximize a very short trip and see this process happen? Out of my PhD study and analyzing the journals, I discovered that students are using 4 processes, which I call the cultural learning cycle. The first one is anticipating. This means that before the experience, they will start thinking about it, and it's very good to actually encourage them to do so. They can go through some of the steps of the experience in their mind. It helps them to understand what their fears might be, what their misconceptions might be, and it's something you can actually process with them if we can actually discuss the idea of anticipating. One of the additional questions we ask before they leave that has to do with anticipation is what do they have in terms of preconceived ideas about what the culture will be like, or what visiting a hospital will be like, or what engaging in a defined activity might be like. So we get them to actually formally even talk about what they anticipate. The next one, the next part of the process is asking them to talk about what they noticed. And this word notice doesn't just mean what they saw. Somebody's wearing a very interesting outfit or but it's more the idea of something that brings an emotional or an affective type of response, because students are receiving input, they're noticing difference, and then there is that response to the difference that they notice. So getting them to think in an organized fashion or a systematic fashion about what it is they actually notice. And these things are done by journaling, having the student actually write it down, or by discussing it as a group. And then the third one is called contemplating. And this is where students, either with themselves, with the faculty member who's on the trip, could be with a cultural guide or someone that they feel comfortable in that culture talking about, but they're actually weighing the meaning of what they noticed. What does it mean? Why do people do a particular behavior? Why is something like it is? So it causes them to start to think, to put things together with what they know about the culture, what they know about themselves, and identify those things. So this is contemplating. The last one is called learning, and learning can take many, many forms. It can be clarity. Yes, I understand now why this behavior, it's because of this and this and this, and they have a clarity. But many times there are other kinds of responses. It could be that a student says, I just don't, I know there must be an explanation. I want to believe that there's an explanation, but at this point, I'm finding it really, really difficult, or I know I haven't been here long enough. Sometimes students will step out at the place to say, I just can't accept that cultural pattern or behavior yet. But the idea of really analyzing where you are and identifying where you are recognizes that really cultural learning isn't something that is happens and then ends. It's like it's a process. And even for Dave and I, as we travel, there's going to be ongoing cultural learning. So the idea that it's okay to say this is as far as I've gotten in my learning. I think the other piece about the cultural learning cycle that we have observed is that the beginning, when you're getting students ready, they're going to spend most of their time in anticipating and some noticing based on what you're telling them. And then when they first get there, the noticing really elevates in terms of the part of the cycle that's emphasized. And it's towards the end of the trip that their ability to anticipate and their ability to notice has achieved some level of success, but now they're spending more of the time in contemplating and in beginning to identify what they learn. And on their return, the learning, and many times they will not be able to be that clear about identifying their learning while they're in country. And so the processing afterwards that continues is the ongoing contemplating and then the learning. Very interesting phenomena on a number of trips that I have noticed is that towards the very end, as we are in the last few days of getting ready to return to the U.S., I find them very, very introspective and sometimes very withdrawn. We've been communicating openly all of these 3.5 weeks, and suddenly they take this process inward. So I think by way of observation, this kind of thing happens and you think, what has happened? But then when you return back to the U.S., it's really, really important that within 2-3 weeks of returning to campus that you debrief again with them, and you will find that the floodgates open. And they will say, when we first got back, we weren't ready to talk. Family and friends, everyone was asking me. I had a student say in one of the interviews, well, when I was finally ready to talk, no one was asking me questions anymore. So they know their learning is deep, and it's sometimes difficult when a parent or a friend or a boyfriend or a girlfriend or a classmate asks about that learning, for them to put that into words at that particular time. And so they often will say, do you want the 5-minute answer or do you want my real answer? Because it takes a while for them to really be able to conceptualize what that learning has been and where they are.
I'm not certain this is true, but I've found that if the last part of the trip includes a long litany of new experiences, if it's a slow pace, that can work. But if they're jumping back into Europe and planning, and at least it feels to me like that some of that learning gets truncated. They're moving on to something new. It's really quite predictable. The last few days, it'll be harder for them to make new friends and to make the effort to reach out, because as Karen's talked about, they're becoming more introspective. And I like to structure so we can stay in that introspective, quiet. The course objectives, I mean, we talk about culture learning, but there's really a lot of self-learning. They sometimes view it as a service trip or as a mission trip or something. It's all about their learning. They're learning about cultures and language and nursing care in different culture, but they're learning about who they are in a different context, envisioning themselves as a different person. And as much as I like to tourist around Europe or whatever, when I'm done as well, I struggle. They're adults, and I don't say no, but I don't necessarily make it easy for them to have this, what can be a dissonant, fun, but dissonant experience. The clip you're about to see is part of a general orientation, touching bases in the geography of the place we're going to be at, to begin the cultural learning cycle and the process of anticipating. We fly into Entebbe, just outside of Kampala, come around Lake Victoria, the second largest lake in the world. By some measures, it's the largest lake, but it's not as deep as Lake Superior. So Lake Superior is deeper. We're going to go up to northern Uganda, Gulu, Lira. This is the Lord's Resistance Army, and there's been a lot of war. For 21 years, there's been war in this area, the Lord's Resistance Army. And we have a safari planned, and I have people on the ground listening. Right now, Joseph Kony, the leader of that, is up in this area, and so this is currently safe. If Kony comes down to this area, we won't be going to Murchison Falls. I have a goal of returning with the same number of students that I leave with. Okay? I even have a stretch goal. My stretch goal is for not just the same number of students, but the actual same students to return. So I'm going to be safe, and if the war flares up in northern Uganda, we won't go there. One of the many ways to learn culture is through connection with a friend. Our neurophysiology really likes that small, intimate setting. Our brains are happy, and our learning goes really, really well in the context of relationship. And I want to have relationships with nurses. Anticipating, noticing, contemplating, and then learning. Does it think that it's really that complicated? Don't you just learn? Dr. Drake did her PhD dissertation looking at the travel journals of students in this course, first 1 year in Kenya and the second year in Uganda. And looking at that narrative data, she thought that this is what she believes and has published now, that this is what happens. That you anticipate something, it starts the neurophysiologic process happening. If you just show up and you haven't thought about it, you can react to it. That's kind of my style. But anticipating what it's going to be like is super important. I want you to focus for a moment and turn to your neighbor, so in groups of 2 or 3, anticipate with your words what meeting after the safari, getting up to Mbale, what's meeting and sitting down and having a one-on-one conversation in English with a Ugandan nurse. What's that going to be like?
Yeah, between like both of us, like we'll have to say things like slower or like, you know what I mean, more clear, and then they'll have to do the same thing. I think we'll have a lot in common. What? I think we'll have a lot in common, like our practice and like no, I think it's gonna be so different.
Anticipate that you're going to have to learn from them and teach with them. I'm a community development expert. Community development is all about reciprocal relationships. This isn't, we're not Santa Claus, we're not Dad, okay? We're not the experts. The job of Savior has already been taken. Share a little bit with me about what kinds of things did you anticipate or did you talk about in that group? Now we could start with you because you probably know more. What do you anticipate sitting down and have a conversation with the nurse will be like?
It's going to be a little awkward.
It's going to be a little awkward at first, okay? So someone who knows really what it's like. Did anyone else feel like, ooh, it's going to be a little awkward? Good. See, you've never been there, and you know for sure. It's almost always awkward meeting somebody new. Okay. What's that going to be like?
You'll probably talk about the things you have in common.
Okay.
So like nursing.
Yeah.
You both have families. You both have your families.
Yeah. Okay. So you can anticipate that there's not complete difference between you and them. That there's going to be overlap of experience. Nursing, families. Okay.
I think even though we do speak the same language, there will be things that can't be expressed the same, because it'll be translated different by them, or different meanings, kind of like what we were talking about.
Right. So you're anticipating that the same words might have a little different meaning there. What else is true about that? Even if the word has the same meaning, what's another challenge that you might have? Yeah.
Not necessarily related to words, but nonverbals. I use nonverbals a lot in understanding others, and it's going to be different.
Yeah.
They have different nonverbals than we do.
That's right. That's right. So you're anticipating that even when the words are the same, some of the meaning might be conveyed differently because of nonverbals, and much of communication happens nonverbally as well. The course is on culture learning and on learning about systems. It's a G course. And it's going to be whitewater rafting. It's going to be Jesus Film Ministry. It's going to be rappelling down a 110-foot waterfall if you want to. You can anticipate all that. Anticipate that if you have to get up at Murchison Falls at 2 a.m., that there may be a hippo between you and the latrine, and that hippos are big. At least at 2 a.m. in the morning.
Of course, the obvious to students, they want to know the detail: where are we going, when are we leaving, where are we staying, what are we going to do. So they need a lot of the logistical information, and they of course need the financial amount right up front so they know how to plan. From an educational standpoint and their cultural learning, they need some cultural general information, which would be the etic information, the information about where they're going, and some cultural information about that. We usually do very cultural general. What is culture? Even though they may have taken an anthropology class, we kind of remind them of sort of very, very general, and then we move more into the specifics of the culture or cultures of the place where we are going, and give them some good background. Depending on places that I go, we may also think about greetings, few little language skills. Some of the places we go, there are so many languages, it becomes difficult to decide which one you might pick. But some settings where I've been, where there aren't so many languages, we begin to give them some language like greetings, and those are so appreciated by the place where they're going. So we do that.
It also connects the language and culture together right away. Hard to learn about.
They're so connected that understanding one helps understand the other. Then students need information about processing. So in our case, we use the cultural learning cycle, and we have several specific reflective journaling assignments, and so we take time to make that very clear. We are using the Purnell's model and its 12 domains for a way for students to look at themselves first and fulfill the understanding of who they are, the emic view of themselves, and we do that by asking them to write that out. And for us, it's often during Christmas, and we leave in January, and that means it's a wonderful time there with family. They're thinking about more traditional things. It's a nice time. Grandpas and grandmas are around, and aunts and uncles. So when you start thinking of what is my family's view on this, that, and the other, it forms a very nice time to kind of be thinking of those things. So they come with that prepared. Of course, this isn't just a sightseeing tour, it's a study trip. So another thing that we make very clear to students is going over the syllabus, knowing what assignments they'll have, what they need to bring with them in order to be successful in meeting the trip objectives. I think one more thing, whether I've had a group that was 11 or some of the larger groups of 27, 30 that we've been leading more recently, it's really good to utilize students as leaders. So I may have a logistical group who helps each time we're moving about to see about the bags and the people and that sort of thing. And then some places we've had to cook or at least do some food kinds of things, so I may get a group of volunteers who will help organize the food things that we have to do. The area of communication, we like to keep their classmates and their family members informed. So rather than having multiple emails saying the same thing, we tend to ask that the group compose something, and then there's very little for the students to maybe need to add in a personal way, especially when we've been in countries where the time on the internet is really very limited because of access. So it also keeps their classmates who aren't abroad informed of what's going on, and then it takes care of family and close friends as well. So we may have a communication committee. So those are some of the ones that have been really helpful. I've also had students sometimes help even with the bookkeeping, something like that, keeping track of our receipts and helping out. So it is a huge job to lead a trip, so when you can begin to get some leadership from students that you're working with, it's good for them and good for you.
Safety is a part of what we do. I set as a goal to return with the same number of students that I left with, and I even have a stretch goal, not just the same number of students, but the actual students, same names and all of that. Although I don't want to return with the exact same students, I want them to be changed. So it's not the same students, but at least the same names and passports. And there are some safety concerns, and not just in a place like Uganda. I think our trips that have gone to Europe and stuff, there's probably been some more, frankly, unsafe student behavior and activities in that setting than in Uganda. But I have hopefully provided the structure, expended my social capital, connections, and friends there so that learning can happen. And my role then, beyond safety and logistics, is just to help them understand what they're seeing, thinking, and feeling, and smelling. It's the processor, and it's just the best role that a faculty person can be. It's a mentoring, formal and informal sessions of chatting, so that the noticing appropriate things, not just things that are different. So there's some guidance in what kinds of things that they are noticing, and then as they move into contemplating what does that mean. So just knowing the steps of learning that they get to Additionally, I do have the logistics role of keeping track of receipts and money, and I think that there's probably a couple different ways to do that. If you have a pretty fluent, a budget that's really strong, you can actually delegate that more to students and prepay and stay at hotels where are prepaid and restaurants that are prepaid and give students money and they spend. I personally try to keep the trip as inexpensive as possible, and so that means more work for me. I might give cash out to students when we're in a city place and they go get a meal, and then I expect change and a receipt from them, and that actually, again, more work for me, but they don't pocket extra money. Anyway, it just helps me keep the processes low while meeting their needs for, one person wants Ugandan food and someone really needs some Chinese food at that particular time. They have the freedom to go. At least when we're in large groups like that, it's just so you don't spend 5 hours at lunch.
A couple other things to add on to that. I think we find students, I think you would say the same, Dave, they sort of have kind of a need to know, what are we doing today, what are we doing next? And I think in some types of trips, you can literally give your plan when you leave here and you stick to it every day. Some of the places that we go, like in Uganda, sometimes it's part of the cultural learning is there has to be a great deal of flexibility. Some things we cannot pre-plan. They occur and there may be some waiting. So while we do our best to be open and honest with them, it's also we try to help them understand that there has to be a little bit of flexibility because that's part of what happens, and we may have to wait an hour here and we may not. We may be able to be there right on time. So I think students do have a need to know, and so we are honest with them about what we know we can plan carefully, and we are honest with them about what has to kind of go with the flow because of the setting where we are. I think the other thing that really is important while in the country, and it's close to what Dave was talking about, and that is being really sensitive to where they are and what they are thinking. I have been on trips where I sensed that they were in a fair bit of cultural stress, and I may have canceled the events of the day that I could, and we just came away and we processed that happened to me once when I was leading a trip in Zimbabwe, and it was really important for me to let them speak about where they were and then to affirm with them that was a very, very natural kind of sense of feeling and where they were in their processing, that was very important. So I think really keeping your ear to and your observations, your own noticing, to use the words of the cultural learning cycle, to just notice where they are and really understand and be able to help them. Sometimes even in anticipation, understanding where they probably are going to be. And sometimes it's one-on-one and also the group processing. And trying to read their journaling as we're traveling with them also gives you a sense of what's not being perhaps said out loud. And so I think those are really, really important roles while you're on the trip. And that part's really emotionally very draining, but yet it's also extremely exciting.
Clicks might form. Someone might have spent all this time and energy and they're not engaged in the cultural learning there. They're texting or emailing back home. There have been situations where safety, illness, a lot of challenges happen. Let me start with the group building and group cohesion. We're a little bit unusual in nursing in that everyone on our trip, except for maybe one TA and the faculty, are senior nursing students who, not that they all know But some of them know each other very, very well, that from freshman year on they've had most of their classes together and are rooming together. So there's a lot of deep friendships, and we want to respect that to the point where it's helpful in their learning, but there are times where those friendships actually get in the way that keep them from fully engaging in the cultures there, or make them so they're not as open to the new experiences.
I think you can frame that to students as the reason is that, I mean, Bethel isn't the first university to discover that it's not a good idea to do that. The literature even is out there in the area of intercultural studies that students need to limit that. Of course, parents and boyfriends and close friends need to know that you're safe, and so we tend to use that group email process as much as we can, and talk very much about limiting the contact. I think it's probably a greater issue in countries where the internet is as readily available as it would be here in the U.S., whereas some of the places that we go, it's naturally limited. The text messaging and the telephones are now, the cell phones are now becoming the next level of ease in which students can now afford to buy minutes and call home at any hour. So I think explaining the reason why you've invested this much money in the trip, and the best thing that you can do for yourself is to really limit that, and that we know from experience that will really help you to get the most out of this experience. The challenge of homesickness, and some of that comes, I think, out of culture shock and not really being able to cope at the moment, is another thing that you may meet in probably every year, and someone in your group will be experiencing some of these signs and having difficulty coping. There'll be, one of the things we do ask in our pre-trip information is we ask students to tell us, how do you think, if we were to observe that you were not coping, what would be some of the things we would see? So we do ask them to kind of define that for us before we leave. But again, close observation by faculty, court members, and the course trip leaders to discover that, and processing that with students. Had an interesting experience this past year in a student who was not coping, and we knew that, but we didn't think it was so significant that it warranted thinking about sending her home. But again, back to this communications, he's communicating to mom, and so then we get the phone call from the mother to ask us to please put the daughter on the next plane home. And so sometimes it's helpful to let students know, what are you communicating? She didn't really want to leave when I discussed it with her, so it's like helping them to understand what are they communicating to parents that makes parents or loved ones feel that they're not coping, and that, you know, we don't know them very well, and therefore we need to put them on the plane. So the best advice is, I think, talking to those students. It's really interesting that in my observation, the students that have had some of the most difficulty in settling in, very interestingly, they seem to have the hardest time also leaving. You'll find those very same journals. I mean, I remember one year a journal said, I can't believe I still have 15 more days or 18 more days here. And then you follow the journal to the end, and it's like, the time has gone by so fast, I can't believe I have to leave now, and I don't really want to leave. So part of it is of course this sensitivity to where they are, and part of it is letting them and helping them wait it out. Literature also does show, though, that, and I think you need to keep this in the back of your mind, that literature does show that the stress of culture for someone who is not emotionally stable can put some people over the edge. And so while I will say that most people will come out fine the other end, we do need to be very, very careful as trip leaders that we are aware of when a behavior or the culture shock or whatever is also pushing a student who may have some other pre-existing emotional conditions that would warrant taking a more aggressive stand. And then I think you have access through telephone, etc., to those here on staff that can advise you in those severe instances. We have been very fortunate that we have never yet had to send a student back home, but you should be aware and recognize. There, of course, can be physical illnesses that occur. You have to help students understand what it means to be safe in terms of their eating. We try to provide safe food, talk about safe water when you're in settings where that's really critical. But if they get ill, then of course we are nurses ourselves, so we feel fairly comfortable for that. But I think if you are not a medical person leading a trip, you want to know in settings where you are, where there are trustworthy healthcare settings where you can go and get advice so that students can get prompt treatment. Encouraging them to visit their own physicians beforehand and come on a trip prepared for some kinds of emergencies that would mean they don't have to necessarily find medical care. They have some provision for travelers. Diarrhea and some of those things with them are really good advice to give, but certainly you need to know where there's health care. I think perhaps the most overlooked part of a trip abroad is the re-entry. And I say this not only from the faculty point of view, but even from the students. We tell our students every year that it will be harder to come back and that they will have more issues to deal with, but most do not believe that that will be the case. So whatever you can do to help students understand that when they re-enter, it's again a major cultural experience that they are usually not very well, no matter how much you say to them, they're not well prepared. We spoke earlier when we were talking about the processing, that it is something that we hope will happen, but that we would like to see it happen under direction, and that is that for the first time they will look at their culture from the etic as an outsider. They will see it having lived in another culture for a while and look at it. And many times they do not like what they see, and that's very, very strange to them. So 2-3 weeks is what's kind of ideal in terms of getting your group back together again and processing with them. I usually conduct it much like a focus group. Ask a few questions. What has it been like since you've come back? And you have very little questions that you need to ask, and it's usually like the floodgates open and they suddenly find the atmosphere of their trip mates and people who understand where they're coming from, and it's they find it very reassuring to find that so and so and so and so and so and so, they've been so busy since school, the first 2-3 weeks of classes have begun again, but to find out that the other people on the trip are experiencing some of the same things that they are, and the floodgates open and they need to talk about what they're seeing and experiencing. For some who are married or in really close relationships, you need to help those students understand that they have had a life-changing experience without their significant other along. And that too can be a really difficult experience that they need to process and that you can help them understand. And so those are some of the very important things to do. It's really difficult to get our students together. It's probably easier for us in nursing, where again they're heavily taking courses in our department and we know their schedules and there are some commonalities that make it easier to schedule times. I know, being on International Studies Committee over the years, we have done a lot of work and have not yet been successful. By rights, it should be mandatory, and that has not been possible yet. So if you can help students understand and provide some kind of experience for them to debrief and process, it's so very important.
Really concur with that, and would start with a confession that I'm very existential, very contextual, very immediate, very now, and that helps a lot when I'm there. But I come back and then I get very contextual and immediate and now on my next new thing, a series of courses. And if there aren't dates in the calendar in students' open door policy where they come and debrief with me, if there aren't external prompts that force me to deal with this processing, then I'll be just like them and omit that step, and just it doesn't feel like good stewardship of time, money, of the great gift, the great tremendous privilege that it is to be able to do a trip like this. It's like you've almost reached the finish line and don't take the time to cross it.
If you remember earlier, we talked about students who have said, when I was finally ready to talk, no one was asking me the questions. And so 2 to 3 weeks after everyone is finished asking, to see their pictures, I mean, I've had students be so upset by the things that interest people in pictures. It's more like, the animals on safari, and students saying, I want to rip those out of my book because that wasn't what my trip was about. And it's about the children we see in the hospital or the family I lived with or whatever. But about the time they're really ready to talk about what the trip was all about, the close friends are no longer asking. And that's why it's an important time to bring the group back together, because now here is a group who is more open and ready to speak than they were, as I have found in the last few days before they leave, when they sort of shut down in terms of their verbalization. They're more internal. But in 2 or 3 weeks, they really are ready and actually need to be able to that's when you find, to come back to the learning cycle, that's when you find they're ready to identify what they've learned.